Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. The US has spent more than $70 billion in Ukraine since Russian troops crossed its border last year. But now a battle is brewing in Washington, D.C. over the Biden administration's request for over $20 billion more. Many Republicans in Congress are opposed. Hardliners in the House want to cut off funding altogether. Others are demanding more oversight. My guest this week is Dora Chomiak, CEO of Razom, a nonprofit Ukrainian-American human rights organization. Dora Chomiak, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Since the war began, the Biden administration and the U.S. Congress has directed more than $7.75 billion in assistance to Ukraine, which includes humanitarian, financial, and military support, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, a German research institute. How much aid has Razom sent to Ukraine? How much have you contributed to Ukraine? And from where you stand, is U.S. tax dollars finding or funding more than just military aid? How's the money being spent?
Sure. And I'd be happy to address both of those things. So, Razom is a private NGO. We were founded in 2014, which is actually when Russia invaded Ukraine. Notice because they didn't call it an invasion, but in 2014, Russian troops crossed the border of sovereign Ukraine, and that's actually when Razom came together. Razom means together in Ukrainian. And since 2014, we've been funded primarily by individual donors. And certainly since the full-scale invasion, when Russia moved in with a lot of tanks and a lot of missiles in February of 2022, our organization has grown tremendously. So we went from being an organization that spent about $200,000 a year, to answer your question, for the first years of our existence, to being an organization that in 2022 distributed $60 million worth of aid. And that was because we were able to move very, very quickly because we have such a strong partnership network in Ukraine and in the United States. So our work now is focused in several different areas. We're delivering tactical medicine and communication equipment to people near the front. We have an advocacy team in Washington, D.C. to address a lot of the questions about why Ukraine is important to the security of the United States. We've distributed grants to over 140 NGOs in Ukraine. And we have a robust program of support of hospitals and medical facilities with aid and smarts education. So we work in a lot of different capacities. I think there's a couple things to be aware of about Ukraine. One, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is happening in Ukraine, but it's actually part of a larger global battle for autocracy and versus democracies. And that's why continued US support of Ukraine is so important. A big chunk of the aid, and I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but a big portion, the US has really stepped up with military aid in terms of just hardware, and that's what Ukraine's been asking for. Much more, a bit more is needed, but another significant part of US tax dollars has been going to simply stabilize the economy, to pay people salaries, and keep the economy going. Something that I found surprised people who discovered Ukraine in the past year and a half is the level of sophistication of the NGO community in Ukraine itself. So Ukraine has gone through multiple civil kind of revolutions and evolutions since it declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. And through those revolutions, the third sector, the non-governmental sector, has really gotten quite sophisticated. So there's the public sector with the government, there's the private sector of business, and then this third sector of NGOs are incredibly sophisticated in Ukraine. And that, coupled with like a 99% literacy rate and 83% rate of people who have secondary or tertiary degrees, so you have this highly sophisticated citizenry that has lots of horizontal ties that really stepped up during the full-scale invasion to start trying to save lives and hold back this unprovoked invasion.
You mentioned a short while ago that a bit more is needed, a bit more resources, a bit more funding. Can you explain to viewers why Ukraine is an important support or important security ally for the United States?
Sure. So Ukraine is about the size of France, or the size of Texas. You've got 40 million people, just kind of give a sense of scale. Ukraine is important for the US because Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a simple violation of an international rules based system. So, since World War II, we've all on the planet kind of agreed that you stay in your own house. You don't like, I'm in New York City right now in an apartment building. I don't expect my neighbor in my apartment building to suddenly punch a hole through my wall and show up in my study here and say, I'm going to live here now. We agreed that we're not going to live like that. That was kind of the point of World War II. And what Russia has done by just moving into Ukraine is violate that, and is now kind of signaling to the rest of the world, like, hey, we can get away with it here, so now it's okay everywhere else. And what Ukrainian citizens are doing is holding the line and saying, no, sovereignty is sovereignty. International borders are international borders. Rules are rules. And defending that structure by defending its territory. So when I say, and I just got back from Ukraine on Tuesday for my latest trip. People like the military there needs hardware. They don't have an arms production industry, and so they're not asking for people; they're asking for equipment. And the U.S. and Western Europe has contributed a lot of equipment, and ammunition and so forth, but not enough to push the Russian military back into its own territory. So that's really what's needed. So what's needed is, you've got a country about the size of France, and missiles are being lobbed at it. So when I was in Ukraine back in August with my family for a vacation, even in Western Ukraine, you could walk to Poland that close. Um, there was a missile strike while we were there. Earlier, there were drone strikes. So the hot fighting is in one small zone, but the terrorism from the Russian Federation across all of Ukraine is all over the whole country. So that's why the air defense is so important. That's why the fighter jets are so important. That's why the ammunition is so important.
I mean, framed the way you have shared, it obviously sort of harkens back to what we saw during the Cold War, this idea that we really have to prevent other proxy wars from taking root, right? And really trying to prevent some of the tragedies that ultimately led to World War II. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the early days of Razom. It was born, as you mentioned, out of the revolution of dignity in 2014, when millions of people worked together and risked their lives to build a pathway to a better future for Ukraine. Can we talk a little bit about the early days? I'm thinking about an image on your website dated November 21, 2013, the first day the first demonstrators gathered in Kyiv. Can you talk a little bit about what the early days look like?
Yeah, it started famously with a Facebook post because at the time everyone was on Facebook. And the democratically elected president of Ukraine at the time, was a guy who was pretty tight with Moscow. And he had been making moves to set the pathway for Ukraine to join the European Union. And then he suddenly met with Putin and had a pivot and was like, nope, we're not doing it. And the Facebook post was from an Afghan Ukrainian, a Ukrainian of Afghan descent, who said, hey, this is not okay. Let's all meet on the main square. And famously, he said, likes don't count. So don't just do a thumbs up on Facebook, but show up. And people showed up, and then more people showed up, and more people showed up. And it really was driven by people in their 20s and 30s who had come of age in an independent and sovereign Ukraine, who didn't remember the Soviet Union. And they were like, yeah, we want to travel, we want to study in Western Europe, we want to work in, in France if we need to, or go do our research in, in Germany if that's what we want to do, and move back and forth. And who's this guy saying, trying to pull us back into this sort of Eastern sphere of influence? And so it started with this kind of youth movement. Um, and then the it could go went on for a few days, a little bit of time, kind of giving you the high level version. And then at one point, the government cracked down with their riot troops, and a lot of people were beaten up.
Wow.
And the next day, these young people were joined by their parents who had participated in a revolution in 2004. And
Wow.
they were joined by their grandparents. So suddenly you have these faces. I mean, it was stunning to watch. I was here in New York, and I had been traveling to Ukraine since 1989. It was stunning to see this multi generational faces of people recognizing, like, hey, we've seen this movie before where the imperialist forces from Moscow are trying to crack down and tell us how to live. And it's not okay. Don't beat up my kids. You saw a lot of, like, things like posters like that. And it was quite a winter. Of course, all of this started right around Thanksgiving in the US, and during some of the coldest months, but people were standing out there, and there was music and dancing, and then it sort of went violent. But throughout it all, it was very much this movement of self-determination, of people in Ukraine saying, we are citizens of Ukraine, we are from different ethnic groups, we are from different religious groups, we are from no religious groups, and we're from all different parts of the country, and we're standing up for wanting to have a say in how our country is run. And that the fact that it was so multi-generational, the fact people started tapping into their history, which they saw had been manipulated for so long. I worked in Ukraine from 91 to 94, and there was a real sort of political awakening in 2013, 2014, where the country came together as a politically aware sort of nation. And, and then right after that calmed down, Russia invaded, literally like days after. So a bunch of people were shot by snipers, um, like literally the day of their funerals. Russia moves into Crimea, and so it's been a long time. And I think it's been 10 years. It's been 10 years of people in Ukraine defending their sovereignty. And when Russia launched the full scale attack in February of 2022 and moved a lot of troops in really fast, expecting that the country was going to fall, I think the world was surprised at how resilient Ukrainians were. But it didn't start that day for people in Ukraine. But now it is very much. I mean, it's exhausting. Not I don't know if anyone like has had small children. You know what it's like not to get a full night's sleep for 4 nights in a row. So people in Ukraine have been awoken by air raids year and a half. And so just the physical toll it is on you is really like it's just terrorism.
Razom unites various Ukrainian activists throughout the US and maintains a global network of over 2,000 people of diverse backgrounds. My question is, you've just returned from Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit about the volunteers, the people behind the project on the ground, how they're doing?
So the people are amazing in Ukraine, because even with these missile attacks and drone attacks, people have spirit and drive and understand that this is important work to be done to really develop Ukraine as a prosperous democracy and to connect it to the world. So it's and how are people doing? It's a loaded question. It's sort of like, how are you? Well, I'm getting drone attacks, and my neighbor thinks I shouldn't be able to exist. Um, but people are living, and sort of the act of living is almost an act of resistance in and of itself. And so simultaneously between air raids, and I live in New York, restaurants are amazing. Coffee, like the food is spectacular, super high quality, you know, coffee, cocktail bars, the music, the art, the creation. It's almost like in the face of destruction and terrorism, this incredibly vibrant creation. And so that's what's fueling, and everybody is volunteering in some way. So everyone has some kind of a day job and some kind of a volunteer job. And it's almost like you people are doing it because the alternative is to cease to exist. And that's not an option. Just the vibrancy, and there's a certain astringent clarity to how people are living. And all that, people are tired. I mean, it's a year and a half of full scale invasion. It's a year and a half of your friends and family who left the country for safety are living overseas. It's a year and a half of, if you're male between 18 and 60, you can't leave the country. You know, it's a year and a half of always having a backpack with your documents and, the go bag ready because you don't know where the Russians are going to fire a missile. But at the same time, there is this incredible depth of realizing where you're from and how many times this movie has played before, how many times people in Moscow have tried to erase Ukraine in various ways through the years. And what I see is people in Ukraine really take great strength in that, in understanding finally their own history. And they're standing on the shoulders of giants, and the just the intergenerational continuity of this. And this notion of a citizenship based identity, not an ethnic or religious, but like if you're a citizen of Ukraine, here's what it means. It is, as an American, for me, and everything America is going through right now, the democracy muscles of my colleagues in Ukraine are spectacular. They have been working out for decades in ways that I fear we here in the States, we've just kind of let some of those democracy muscles atrophy. We've let those critical thinking skills kind of atrophy. We've let those small community projects and horizontal connections, like we hadn't invested much in that. And so there's a lot that Ukraine has to contribute to the United States, in addition to straight up security and international rules based order. And so
Can we talk a little bit about the environmental impacts of the conflict? I know this is, we have before and after images of a major dam and hydroelectric power plant in the Russian occupied southern Ukraine space. And I want to know if you could talk a little bit about what we are or what you are seeing on the ground in terms of environmental impact.
I'm so glad you're raising this because it's so awful that it's not talked about a lot. So basically, the Russians blew up a dam at Kakhovka. So the whole hydroelectric power station flooded downriver. So you have flooding. You have a bunch of people who now don't have water. You have, on top of that, especially in the Russian occupied territory, highly, like, they mined it a lot, and now the water has swept up those mines, and now the mines are, to use a technical term, sloshing around all over the place and contaminating a giant swath of the country. Um, so, I mean, it's just like it's ecocide, right? It's like ecocide added to the genocide, added to the terrorism, and and the Russian occupied places, they weren't evacuating the civilians, so and we can't go into the Russian occupied. I mean, we're a U.S. NGO, we're not a military, and like we're not, but we were able to help a lot of communities on the part that's controlled by Ukraine. And what was amazing to me is literally within hours how we saw in our network of these 140 NGOs how people started collaborating right away and figuring out, like, I've got a truck, I've got water bottles, you take this, you take that, let's go figure it out. I've got boats, inflatable Zodiac boats. We took a lot of things that we had in our warehouse and started distributing right away. And since then, we've installed 10 water filtration stations that are made in Ukraine. We're trying to procure as much stuff from Ukraine as we can to support the economy now, to create jobs now during the invasion. And it's also it's smart. I think it's the right way to do things because we're shoring up the economy now, creating jobs. And also, these are the people on the ground who have the expertise of what's going to work and what's not going to work. So these water filtration stations from this company called Wise Water, they not only build the station, but they would work with us and with local administrations to figure out the best place to put them, and then they service them. So you've got, like, it's ongoing. It's truly sustainable development. But the environmental impacts of this ecocide of the Russians blowing up the dam is just tremendous. And they've also mined so much of the territory particularly over the past half year, that, like, the land and the water is just going to take a very long time to deactivate those mines. And then in the meantime, all the grain that Ukraine's been distributing, particularly to the global south, isn't able to get to where it needs to get to. So now the Russians have weaponized that as well. And so it's sort of like the war is happening on the territory of Ukraine, but it really is on a much wider global scale.
Pretty soon, Razom, as a member of the American Coalition of Ukraine, will be taking part in the third hashtag Ukraine Action Summit in DC this fall. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this type of advocacy. What is happening? What is expected? What is the expectation in terms of heading to DC for a third summit?
Yeah, these summits we put together with dozens of other organizations from across the United States. And the expectation is really to educate people about how to be active citizens in the United States, how to make sure that your voice is heard to the policymakers about your understanding of the importance of Ukraine, of Ukraine being victorious for the security of the United States. So we're going to be doing a lot of education. We're going to have a lot of meetings on the Hill with members of Congress and staff. And what we found is that this is a good way to really focus people's attention and make sure that people in Washington have good information about what's happening in Ukraine, and then also educate citizens so that when they go back to their districts, they're vocal in educating their policymakers and their neighbors that Ukraine is not some faraway, irrelevant thing. Ukraine is in your front yard, even if you don't know it. Because if you want to have a rules-based system, if you want to have a peaceful country, you need to stand with Ukraine now, regardless of all the other things you can disagree on. Like, here is a thing to agree on, because we're in the United States, built on democracy. We're built on this, like, frontier individualism and coming together when we need to come together. And that's what people in Ukraine are doing now. And we all need to do our part to support people in Ukraine so that we can live the kind of life we want to live here.
Dora Chomiak is president of Razom, an international nonprofit that supports efforts to build a more prosperous, democratic Ukraine. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or YouTube. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.